Listeners, beware. This podcast contains themes of the macabre and does not shy away from the details. Our content is graphic and our language is colorful. We might not be your cup of tea, so listener discretion is strongly advised. You have tuned in to The Killer Tea, a podcast hosted by two best friends with a proclivity to decipher the deeply demented minds of murderers.
Happy Halloween! Welcome to episode 2 of The Killer Tea
with your hosts, Chelsea and Christina.
On today's episode, we will be talking about
the killer clown himself,
John Wayne Gacy.
In Des Plaines, Illinois, near Chicago, a man who served time in prison for sex crimes was let out. Today, they found the bodies of at least 3 young boys buried under his house.
He killed 33 times. 33 families forever changed. Tonight in News Extra, the victims of John Wayne Gacy. John Wayne Gacy.
So, Chelsea, why don't you go ahead and drop a little bit of a trigger warning, because we might need it for this one.
Trigger warning for Mr. Gacy. There are themes of sexual assault, rape, and murder.
And just a smidgen of torture, but we're not going to go heavy on the details on that one.
No, there won't be any heavy details on this one.
We are not going to have a repeat of David Parker Ray. That one was very intense.
And very heavy.
Chelsea, why don't you go ahead and talk murder to me?
Oh, baby. You got it. You ask and you shall receive.
All right, set the scene.
Picture this. Illinois. John Stanley Gacy and Marion Elaine Robinson had Mr. John Wayne Gacy in March of 1942. Gacy also had 2 sisters. That kind of sets the happy little family, 2 girls, 1 boy.
I mean, that's what John Sr. wanted more than anything. He had the 2 girls.
And he wanted a son.
That was going to be who carried on the family name and carried on his name, because he's John Sr. and
Correct.
Then John Wayne is going to be Jr.
So John Sr. didn't exactly get the son that he was hoping for.
No, John Sr. he loved to go fishing, hunting.
He was a real man's man.
He was a man's man, and he wanted a son that wanted to play baseball and sports and do all the things that he wanted to do with a father-son.
But that is not the son that he got. John Wayne Gacy had a heart defect that actually left him unable to play sports or really do a whole lot of any physical activity.
No, on top of that, he was a more sensitive kid. He enjoyed cooking with his mother and gardening and hanging out with his big sisters. Mm-hmm. He was not a stereotypical boy.
No. He was not a stereotypical boy. And this really enraged his father, who happened to be an abusive alcoholic.
His father would commonly say things like, gonna grow up to be a queer, call him a patsy.
A mama's boy.
Because he was such a violent drunk, his mom was actually an amazing woman, an amazing mother, and she would interfere. She would try and use her body to shield the kids, to shield John from his dad's abuse. And because of this, his dad would call him a sissy or a mama's boy.
Right. I mean, it's a pretty sad situation that it was said that his father would come home from work and would go to the basement and would drink heavily. John and his sisters and his mother would just sit in fear, waiting for him to reemerge from the basement because they didn't know what version
of their father they were going
to get that night.
Then this is why you don't be a fucking drunk, alcoholic son of a bitch to your children, because you could make a murderer.
Yes. It is also said that John was actually hit very hard in the head with a swing as a young boy, and this actually formed a blood clot in his brain that made him have episodes of blacking out, and his father thought that he was using these blackouts as an excuse to not do the things that his father thought he should be doing, when in actuality it was a serious brain injury.
To this motherfucker, you want to talk about toxic masculinity? This motherfucker would accuse his son, who at this time is a little boy, we're talking 6, 7 years old,
Very little.
passing out from physical activity, blacking out, all kinds of stuff. He would accuse him of faking and doing it for attention. He was the patriarch, the stereotypical one. He felt like his duties were to put food on the table and pay the bills, and after that, he was done. He didn't have to be nurturing.
No.
He fulfilled his role. It was the mother's role to be nurturing.
But it should be said here that John Wayne Gacy did not hate his father.
No.
He made it his life ambition to try to make his father proud of him. I think that is kind of sad in a way. I mean, I'm not sympathizing with John Wayne Gacy in any way, shape, or form, but little boy John Wayne Gacy, I mean, that is sad if you think you are a constant disappointment to your father. I mean, how big of an impact must that have on you as a child?
Well, in John's case, it was it impacted every aspect of his life.
It really did.
Irrefutably, it impacted his entire life.
100%. Teenage John was going to school, and he was a more robust young man.
Yeah. So paired with his heart atrophy, is that what it was called?
I don't know exactly what he had. I just know it was a condition that kind of kept him from being able to play sports or do other physical activities, things like that. So he was, a heavier set young man, and mixed with his sensitive nature, this caught him a little bit of bullying.
Yeah. The worst of the bullying truly came from his father. John just couldn't live up to his expectations.
No.
He didn't do, on top of that, because he was in and out of the hospital so much for these health conditions, his grades started failing.
Yeah,
which
his grades weren't that great.
That in turn encouraged more anger from his father. The icing on the cake also was he did have problems with bedwetting. So he got even more rage from his dad. This kid got tons of love from his sisters and his mother, but nothing from his father, which is the person that he craved it from the most. So
one of the other things that happened with John that caused an even bigger kind of issue with his dad was he was actually molested by a family friend that I believe worked in construction.
So John would walk home from school. Yes. And on his route home, this family friend would pick him up. During that time, that's when he would actually molest John. And John was so consumed by shame of it because his dad was already saying, you patsy, you pansy, you blah, 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 blah. He couldn't bring himself to tell him, but he acted out in other ways. And so what was happening to him, he then took that with another boy and another girl, and actually they more or less molested her. But John wasn't doing it out of malicious interest. This was happening to him, and so I think he was trying
to cope with it, essentially.
Yeah.
Because of this abuse that he suffered from his dad, he actually left home pretty early to escape the abuse and moved to Las Vegas, of all places.
John got a job at a mortuary.
Of all places to get your first job, a mortuary.
He lived at the funeral home. Right. He had a bed on, well, it was a cot. It wasn't even really a bed at the funeral home. And while he was working there, he climbed into the casket of a young teenage boy looking for comfort, I don't know what he was looking for.
I don't know what he was really thinking there, but he definitely climbed into a coffin with a dead body and found that he enjoyed it.
Yeah, he felt he was very lonely, and he climbed into this coffin and snuggled up next to old Stiffy and...
Oh my God. Things that make you go,
things that make me go, nope. Regardless, it was also interesting to me that he was a young teenage boy that he climbed into the coffin with.
Yeah, I think that's a little bit of foreshadowing for dear old John there.
I wonder if that's not where it begins with the teenage boys.
I think it does in a way. I definitely think that was kind of a experience for him.
I don't know. That's a lot. There's a lot to unpack there.
Clearly, that impacted him because shortly after that, he left Las Vegas and actually moved back home.
But he did graduate from business college shortly after.
Yeah, he went to Northwestern Business College in Illinois and graduated in 1963.
He marries his first wife,
Marilyn Myers, and she was a co-worker at the Nunn Bush Shoe Company where they both worked.
In 1964, something really important happens with John, where he joins the political movement a little bit. He joins the Democratic Party, and he thinks that this is something that is going to make his dad proud. He thinks that, it's going to be showing off some of his manlyhood and his contribution to the community. And actually, him being a Democrat made his father think
even more disappointed.
Yeah, called him a patsy for joining the Democratic Party, but that actually didn't dissuade John. He continued. He joined the JCs, which is an organization that teaches leadership and offers civic opportunities for the members.
The full name of that is actually the United States Junior Chamber.
You might be expecting John to be very antisocial and quiet and shy, kind of the stereotype, but actually he is everything.
The exact opposite. He was noted as being really charismatic and jovial and happy and outgoing and willing to help anyone with anything.
People loved him.
And he really rose to the top of the JCs fairly quickly.
Yeah, he quickly became vice president, and at this point in his life, he appeared to be an outstanding member of society. Things weren't always as they appeared because the JCs actually had a little bit of a dark side. That is very weird.
They did. They participated in a lot of swinger activity.
Yeah. Wife swaps.
And wife swapping.
Now, mind you, like in 1964, what is this dude, like 22, 24, something like that? He's got to be in his early 20s. He's a young dude.
He's a young man.
And they're doing wife swaps that his wife is like totally down for and participates in. I watched a documentary where his sister comes into town. For some reason, they're drinking, and John, completely unabashed, said sometimes, we go out and I don't always come home with the same person. His sister was like, John, you're so funny.
You're such a joker.
Well, that night he went home with a different person. She was like, they were raised Catholic, the Roman Catholic. So to them, she was like, pearl clutch. What do I do?
Horrified.
I do declare.
She's not Southern.
Well, yeah, she's
from
not.
Illinois.
Sorry, it's the North
Midwest.
Carolina.
What's wrong with you?
Chelsea has people that she knows in parts unknown Chicago.
Parts unknown Chicago? Did you mean Illinois?
Whatever.
So we should note that he had 2 daughters with Marilyn.
Yes, we don't have their names though.
No, we do not. Their names I don't think have ever
they've tried to be
put out there.
Very private.
Wouldn't you?
Yes, I would fucking disappear from the world.
So I think it's very interesting that we should really, really focus in on this is John's methodology when it came to parenting was very influenced by his father, but in the best way that it could have been. Mm-hmm. John firmly believed that you should not hit your children. He did not believe in physical discipline. He basically wanted to be the complete opposite of his father and was known for being a very loving, caring, sensitive father to his girls.
It is very important to say that these were authentic feelings. This wasn't acting. This was real. The light of his life was when his children were born. His mother and his sister described his face the first time that he saw his daughter was just absolutely jovial, which is ironic considering the night before he had his first homosexual encounter with a I think he was 16.
I think so. He took someone home from the bar.
If you believe John's side of the story, was that he got drunk, fell asleep, and he woke up in this man's bed, that they had sex and everything, or the guy performed oral sex on him. Mm-hmm. And then he rushed to go meet his baby.
As you do.
As you do. So
I do think it's very, very interesting that he was such a loving father figure and that he was so involved with his girls. I think it's just...
There's duality.
There is.
For sure.
I really, really struggle with the psychology on him.
This one is really hard to... What I talked about in the first episode was you would be doing a great disservice to try and put a serial killer in a little box.
Because they do... I mean, and I think when we get more into John, you'll kind of see something completely different from David Ray Parker.
Yeah.
Or David Parker Ray.
What you put into your mind when you picture John Wayne Gacy is what you will very quickly find is not how he is.
No.
He's a paradox. He is really a paradox. Is. John has his baby, falls in love. He's still in the JCs. And you know how we talked a little bit about the JCs having a wife swap and all that stuff? The JCs also allowed for him to kind of start tapping into his darker side when it came to young teenage boys, because these boys that were active in his political group and were employed by him, he opened up a club of sorts in his basement where he would invite young people, especially the boys, and he would ply them with alcohol and drugs. What he would do once they were a little drunk or whatever, he would come onto them, and if they rejected or were weirded out, he'd make it into a joke, or he would say that he was testing their integrity as a JC's member. So he was able to play it off.
In 1967, this is when his little perfect life kind of starts to crumble. Gacy lured 15-year-old Donald Voorhees into his home.
This kid was one of the members' sons.
Yes, that's right.
He said to him, "Hey, have you ever seen a stag film?"
That's what it was.
So he was enticing him. That's what they used to call porns back in the day. A pornographic film was called a stag film. So he was kind of baiting him with a, "Hey, you want to come see this video that I've got?"
Right. So he gets poor Donald drunk and then forces Donald to perform oral sex.
And he pays him $50 and threatens that he's going to kill him if he says anything. So he basically
manipulates and threatens Donald into silence. And this goes on for several months.
Yeah, so Donald keeps quiet about it for a little bit, but then eventually he does tell his parents.
Yeah, he finally breaks down and tells his father, who immediately reports Gacy to the police.
Gacy went as far as to say that those accusations were politically motivated by this other JC's member because he was power hungry and he just wanted to move up the ranks quickly. And he knew that this allegation of sodomy would completely derail Gacy.
Another thing that Gacy does is in 1968, after the charges were filed, Gacy actually paid an employee of his to physically assault Voorhees so he wouldn't come to court.
I think this kid was 16, sprayed him in the face with mace while screaming at him to not continue to press charges.
Right.
This kid was actually awesome. He took the beating and immediately went to the police.
Yeah, he showed up in court. And
Gacy pled guilty and got 10 years for the sodomy charge.
Yep.
Which you would think was a really, really wonderful act of swift justice.
But
tell me all about that swift justice, Chelsea. How well did that work?
Gacy was sentenced to Anamosa State Penitentiary and quickly became a model prisoner. He was friendly towards the other inmates and staff and served as the head chef in the kitchen of the prison.
Which is actually part of the way that he gained influence and power in the prison, because he was actually a really talented chef. You know, when you're in prison and you're eating shit food, if you suddenly have a guy that's more than happy to cook for you and make the shit food into deliciousness.
Hey, people are gonna like you more. It was said that he made friends with the guards.
He made friends with
everybody, and he was considered a model prisoner. And because of this, he only served 16 months of his 10-year sentence and was released on good behavior.
Yeah, that good behavior I think is hilarious because during his stay in that prison, he stumbled across 2 inmates partaking in
oral sex.
Yeah, there's no other way to say it, basically.
Just get it out there.
He had a violent outburst and violently attacked those people, but that went unreported, and he still had good behavior. Oh, so good.
So while he was in prison, Gacy's father actually died and was informed 2 days after the death, and witnesses say that he collapsed and sobbed uncontrollably and would say that he believed his father died knowing he was a failure and that his father died because of Gacy, that he had died of disappointment.
If you can picture a glass window that maybe has a few cracks in it, he hears this news and essentially that glass window shatters. Everything that was holding him together falls apart because even though his dad was horrible to him, even though he was abused and verbally assaulted his entire life, it was so important to him that his father be proud of him. And at this point, he had failed, especially now that his father knew that he was
in prison for sodomy.
Yeah. And that is going to be the last thing that his father knows about him. Mm-hmm. And even though his sisters and his mother tell him, his father essentially died of alcoholism.
Yeah. It had nothing. It really had nothing to do with John and his sentence.
Yeah, it wasn't stress or anything. It was cirrhosis of the liver. He'd been an alcoholic his entire life. But yeah, John kind of takes the brunt of this news onto himself and blames it totally on his behavior. Mm-hmm. And that glass shatters.
And I think it's kind of interesting that we really see his behavior kind of escalate here. Yeah. So he gets out of prison in 1970 and returns to Chicago to live with his mother. And at this point, he actually started his own contracting business called PDM, Painting, Decorating, and Maintenance. And this is where he actually meets his second wife, Carol Hoff, who was an old high school friend and was recently divorced with 2 kids of her own. And she knew of his criminal history.
And she knew of his bisexuality.
And married him anyway.
Yeah, she came out with it he came out with it and told her that he was bisexual. And while she wasn't thrilled about it, mm-hmm. they still got married.
And she accepted it.
Yeah, they moved very quickly. After 3 months, her children, her daughters, were calling him daddy. Yeah. So she's on the move.
So this is kind of where his life seems to kind of stabilize a little bit here. This is kind of like the mask coming back up and really starts being like an active, amazing member of Chicago's community.
Everybody loved him. Yes. They thought he was incredible. In all fairness, if we're speaking truthfully, until he started killing people, like even while he was killing people, he was devoted to his community.
He really was.
He loved children. Oh, that was a poor choice of words.
He did. He loved kids, and he did. He loved kids. None of his victims were prepubescent.
Yeah, they weren't little kids. No, they were still children, but they weren't.
Yes, they were children, but they were teenagers.
Yeah.
Whereas the little kids, I mean, he volunteered at children's hospitals. He was very active in his community.
And charities.
I mean, he was a huge philanthropist.
Gacy is a 36-year-old building contractor who reportedly dressed like a clown to entertain at children's parties. And after hearing the remains of more bodies were found at Gacy's house, Judge Marvin Peters ordered him held without bond.
Whenever people picture John Wayne Gacy, they do picture Pogo the Clown.
Yes, and I think it's important to touch on Pogo.
Pogo was like his last remaining bit of innocence in childhood. Whenever he would dress up as this clown for the charitable events and all of that stuff, he said that anything kind of went. You could be a child again. He felt like a child again. He could be goofy and make people laugh, and he absolutely loved that.
He actually belonged to a club of sorts. I don't remember what it's called, but it was a club that was for clowns. Mm-hmm. And he was a part of this. He was a member, and they would go to children's hospitals, and they would do events, and Pogo the Clown was his character. And if you look at traditional clown makeup, and then you look at Pogo the Clown's makeup, his makeup is very like pointy and angled, whereas most clown makeup is much rounder and more friendly.
Oh, I never thought about that before.
It's kind of interesting. That was pointed out in one of the podcasts that I was listening to learn more about him. They pointed out that his makeup was actually a little bit more sinister, but without being overtly creepy.
Interesting.
Although I find Pogo the Clown to be very creepy.
I find clowns to be creepy.
I don't like clowns.
In general, perpetual laughter is just strange.
It is. So in 1972, in January, his wife Carol was off with the girls visiting family, so they were out of town. And Timothy McCoy, who was 16 at the time, was visiting Chicago when Gacy picked him up and offered him a bed in his home. The two engaged in sex, and the next morning, McCoy thought he would be all nice and make Gacy breakfast and walked into the bedroom to wake Gacy up and had the kitchen knife in his hand. Gacy says that he thought that McCoy was trying to kill him, so he killed McCoy. He said that he admits that that was a mistake, but this is where he first realized that he really got the thrill of killing.
I actually heard a really gross thing that he said.
Oh, do share.
That he had the most amazing orgasm after killing him.
Oh.
I know, it's terrible. Fucking gross.
So that takes us then to 1974, where Gary confessed to the raping and killing of a 14 to 16-year-old boy. He didn't know his name, but he buried him in his backyard.
Yeah, I'm hoping that, as time goes on, more names, I think, are going to be put to this as DNA testing evolves.
Oh, yeah.
But it's still so sad that even now in 2019, several of his victims aren't identified.
In 1975, that's when he comes up with his handcuff trick, is what he called it.
The infamous handcuff trick.
And he actually had two victims. Anthony Antonucci, who was 15, was hired by Gacy to work for PDM. And that is one thing that I do want to know is, so Gacy owned this company, right? Mm-hmm. But he primarily hired teenage boys to work for him under the pretense that their labor was cheaper.
Something culturally to touch on here is in the 50s and 60s and the 70s, you were considered a man at 16.
That's true.
My dad... granted, that was before his time, but my dad left home when he was 16 and got an apartment and that kind of stuff. So
that's true.
The mentality is very different, but they are still young teenage boys where most of them do live at home.
Right. So Anthony is working for Gacy, and Gacy tricks Antonucci into wearing the handcuffs, but Antonucci was able to escape. And that takes us to our next victim, who was not as fortunate, John Butkovich, who was also employed by Gacy. Butkovich was handcuffed and strangled to death and later buried under his garage.
So this one is kind of, they're all horrible and unfortunate, but this kid left his home in Chicago to essentially confront Gacy. He had stopped working for him after 8 months, and he never got his last paycheck.
Right.
I don't have any information as to why he didn't get his last paycheck, but he went to Gacy's house under the pretense to, he was going to get that paycheck.
Oh, yeah.
At some point in time, something happened, and he ended up dead.
Yep. Poor kid.
Fucking horrible.
Something else interesting also happened this year. In 1974, this is when Gacy divorced his wife, Carol.
Oh, God.
He told her that he didn't want to sleep with her anymore, and he wanted to explore his bisexuality more. And so she was just like, fuck this shit, I'm out. Gacy was left to his own devices in their nice old house all by himself.
Gacy calls this time of his life the cruising years.
We all know that he's got a big body count. Like, you don't have to know that much about Gacy to know that.
Yeah.
And if you're wondering how so many of these teenage boys are going missing, you have to remember that back in the 60s and the 70s,
it was not uncommon in that time period for teenagers to just leave.
Go sow their wild oats, travel, you know? It was the 70s. Like,
that's what they did,
that's
unfortunately.
What they did. These children were being reported missing by their parents. They were going to the police and filing missing persons reports. The police were like, you know, they're teenagers. They'll be back. Or that kind. Unfortunately, this is a ever-present theme throughout many, many decades of missing kids. Someday I'll find the statistics of how many reported missing peoples actually turn up. Yeah. Because there is a reason why the police do this. They probably get hundreds, if not thousands, of missing persons reports all the time, and it's usually rebellious runaways who end up coming home.
Yeah.
But all these kids that they were getting missing persons reports were because of Gacy, not because they were running away from home.
That takes us to the next year, then, 1976. Should we talk about how many victims he had that year, or do you want to talk about the victims?
So let's talk about, he had a ton of victims that year. What was his head count that year?
That year, he had 14 victims.
He got sick and tired of having to dig graves for these kids. And he wanted the graves readily available. At this time, he's still burying all of these kids underneath his house in his crawl space. So what he gets another 16, 17-year-old kid to dig trenches?
Yeah, he tells him that they're having problems with the sewer lines.
With the sub pump.
The sub pump, and needs trenches dug in his crawl space to allow for pipes.
He's only allowed to dig in these very specific locations.
Tells these kids where they need to dig these pipes, and these boys are essentially digging their own graves.
David Cram is the one boy in particular that was digging these trenches for the piping, and he's hired to do this job. He does it well. Gacy's pleased with him and even offers him to rent a room in his new bachelor pad.
Yeah.
And believe it or not, like, this kid successfully lives there for a little while and doesn't end up dead. But one night, Cram comes home and Gacy is shit-faced drunk, sitting on the couch in his clown costume.
Can we just take a moment to picture this shit? So, you've been out all day. You're a young person. You come home, and your landlord is dressed up as a motherfucking clown, just chilling in his armchair, wasted off his ass.
I would board the motherfucking Nope train to get the fuck out of Nope Town. So fucking Nope. Hell to this motherfucker. No. Just,
But to be fair,
just too much.
Let's just say that in the 1970s, clowns were not this terrifying creature that they are now. Being afraid of clowns is a more modern concept.
Well, nope.
Segue, fun fact. It is speculated that Pogo the Clown gave Stephen King inspiration for the book It.
Oh, I absolutely believe
I
that.
100% believe that.
Yeah.
And now clowns are terrifying.
All right, so he comes into his drunk boss,
Yes, back to the story.
landlord and boss, and Gacy's like, hey, come have some Mai Tais with me.
Yeah, as you do, Mai Tais.
So they have a few drinks, and Gacy does the handcuff trick to him. Mm-hmm. And Gacy handcuffs himself and shows him, and then he escapes out of it. And David is like, oh, how did you do that? And he's like, here, I'll show you. And allows him to be handcuffed. Yeah. And David can't figure it out. And he's like, all right, what's the secret? How do you get out of this? And Gacy pulls the key out of his pocket, and he says, the trick is
to have the key.
David gets pissed off. He's like tired of being like Gacy's poking fun at him. Oh, is that good? Is that funny? And he gets tired of it. And he's like, if you don't take these fucking handcuffs off me, I'm going to beat the shit out of you.
Yep.
So Gacy, it's like a switch is flipped.
Yep. It's like a switch flips. The mask falls off and Gacy turns into this monster.
He literally starts growling.
Yeah.
Growling.
David has said that he was growling like a dog, was making guttural noises, was swinging him around the room,
saying, I'm gonna rape you!
Screaming that he was gonna rape him. I mean,
that is nightmare fuel.
180, just complete turnaround.
Nightmare fuel. So,
yeah.
David...
Especially in a clown?
Yes!
Like, oh my God,
that was like... PTSD. That if you didn't know how to get it, that's how you fucking get it.
That's how you fucking get it.
That is how you fucking get it. So this kid is able to like run away and he locks himself in his room. Gacy falls asleep, wakes up sober, and then he fucking splits. Yes. He's done. He's out of there. But luckily David survived.
Yes, he did. So that's one of the few survivors that there actually were.
Very few survivors.
And in 1977, Gacy had...
Was this his oldest victim, the 27-year-old Jeff Rignall?
Yeah, that was in 1978. In 1977, he actually had 11 victims in 1977. And one of them is actually really sad. So 19-year-old Robert Donnelly was a victim in 1977. And Gacy actually set him free after sexual torture, for hours. And he went and reported it to the police. And the police came to talk to Gacy, and Gacy claimed they were in a consensual sex slave relationship, and the police believed him. And I really boil this down to how popular he was in the community, that the police just took what he said as truth and didn't look into this any further.
And they're like, we're not going to prosecute you. You're a nice fella.
You're a nice guy.
Even though you were convicted of sodomy.
It should be noted, though, that his sodomy charge was in Iowa, not Illinois.
Oh.
And so at that point in time, a lot of those departments, they didn't really talk to each other. This is before computers and electronics and things like that. So, I mean, there really wasn't any way for him to know about this. And on top of that, when he was in Iowa, so this is like a way backtrack, but when he was in Iowa, this is something that's like hella fucked up. So when he was on parole, this bastard actually went to a train station and tried to pick up another teenager and tried to get him in his car, tried to sexually assault him, but the kid got away.
I didn't hear that.
And the kid went and reported it to the police, but when charges were brought up on Gacy, the kid failed to show up in court.
Oh, yeah. Okay.
And the charges were dropped. And none of this ever made it back to Gacy's parole officer. And so he slipped through the cracks. Like, he was breaking parole. He should have gone back to prison, and he didn't. And if he had gone back to prison, none of these other murders probably would have happened.
So technically, by 1977, Gacy has successfully evaded most punishment. I mean, he did serve 16 months out of a 10-year sentence.
But he has successfully evaded.
I count that as slipping through their fingers.
Oh, yeah.
So at this point, there was him getting out early at 10 years, then this kid not showing up to court, and then these other guys deciding not to prosecute him. Yeah. 3 times that the justice system failed its citizens. Yep. No offense, but full offense.
And until 1978, all of his victims were buried in his crawl space.
Oh, God.
Can you imagine the smell that had to be coming from his house?
Yeah, so I can't even, nope. How can you live with that? Like, nope, fuck that, nope. Jeff Ringall says that Gacy enticed him into his car by offering him marijuana before using chloroform to render him unconscious. Ringel says that Gacy then drove him to his house, handcuffed him, and sexually assaulted him before ultimately letting him go. $3,000 civil suit was settled in the case, and Gacy was also not charged with, he was charged with battery, which is a misdemeanor. Yep. So at this point, there's now 2 official sexual assault charges against him.
Yep. And in 1978, there were another 3 victims that he killed on top of assaulting Jeffrey Rignall, but this time he threw their bodies into the Des Plaines River, which was his new burial ground, because he ran out of fucking space under his house.
He literally ran out of fucking space. I think we're both unanimous in our opinions that, like, shit's gotten bad.
Oh, it's gotten hella bad.
It's gotten pretty bad. So 1978.
His downfall.
He actually is, because, he's active in politics and the JCs and all of that stuff. He is the son of a second-generation son of a Polish immigrant. He was appointed the director of the Polish Constitution Day Parade in Chicago, and he served in that office for like 3 years. It was during that time that he got his picture taken with then First Lady Rosalind Carter. And it's a very famous picture.
Oh, I know.
Can you believe that the most infamous serial killer in American history at the time was like literally centimeters away from the First Lady?
Escorting her. Like he was
mingling with
the
First Lady.
Like he was in a place of honor at this point.
That fucking just blows my mind. He joined the Moose Club. He joined the Jolly Joker Clown Club. He came up with, that's, how we talked about where he came up with Pogo and Patches the Clown. He even performed at these Democratic parties as this clown. Like, 1978 was a weird time for this dude.
Robert Piest was working at a store. Gacy comes in, is basically talking to him, how much money do you make? How much are they paying you here? Basically trying to entice this kid into coming and working for him, because as we know, that's where most of his victims are coming from, is the company he worked for. Which, okay, how did the cops not notice that all of these kids that are going missing all work for Gacy? I mean, not all of them did, but a good majority of them did.
I don't know, man.
How many kids have to go missing from the same company before you go,
Well, so he does successfully entice them because he's promising them $5 an hour, which is double what most people are making.
Piest is at the store and his mom comes to pick him up, right? And he says, just hang on a minute. I'm going to talk to this guy about a job. Well, he doesn't come back. His mom's sitting there waiting for him.
Walking the store, looking at stuff, waiting for him.
And he never comes back. Well, his mom is like, wait a second. My son was talking to this man. Like, I just saw him and now he's gone. Mm-hmm. So this is kind of what really gets it going. So the cops come to talk to Gacy. Gacy denies his allegations, but his alibi didn't match up with the witnesses that saw him at the store talking to Piest. They finally figure out his previous criminal record and decide, maybe we should look into this.
The craziest thing about this whole story, to me, this one is the most tragic one, because could you imagine being a mother and your baby is literally feet away from you and is snatched? Yeah. Like, ugh.
I can't even imagine.
But the thing that infuriates me also as a parent, all these other parents had reported their children missing, but because they were like a little bit rebellious and maybe some of them may have had some like minor offenses or whatever, but were just, because they were rambunctious teenagers, they were kind of like blown off. But because Robert was...
And not to mention only parents, but there's been at least 2 other people who have come forward and said, hey, he sexually assaulted me. And the cops are just like, no, he didn't.
This was fine.
You're silly.
If Robert hadn't been such a honor roll student, like well-to-do child...
I don't think they would have paid any attention to it.
They straight up would not have paid any attention to it. It was because that it was just so out of character for Robert and his mother's insistence that there was absolutely no... His mother and his dad actually took their two German Shepherds out that night searching for him.
Yep.
Like, they were ready to fuck some shit up.
They were. The cops finally start looking at Gacy, and the allegations that were coming through for Piest, and then new information that was finally being paid attention to coming from Rignall and David Cram, finally get the cops like, oh, we should get a warrant. And so they get the warrant, are surveilling Gacy, and it should be noted, I think they tailed him for about 10 days to 2 weeks. And at this point, Gacy starts falling the fuck apart.
Well,
he starts drinking. He's getting belligerent with the cops. He's not understanding why they're following him.
Everything that I've heard was totally opposite of that. Like, I watched and read.
Yes.
Tons of papers.
Yes.
Tons of documents. I watched 4 documentaries on this. Mm-hmm. And 3 of those 4 documentaries presented the cops trailing him and all of that stuff, and being good investigators and going into the house during this warrant and smelling something odd. Mm-hmm. And it just makes it sound like really good detective work, right?
Right.
Come to find out, these cops have spoken on camera saying they had to constantly remind themselves that this guy was a murder suspect, that they were hanging out with him, that he was such a likable guy that Gacy looked over at them and said, well, if you're going to be following me, just sit down and have dinner. And he bought them all dinner.
Right. I heard that was how it was at the beginning, and he's even quoted as saying that clowns can get away with murder.
So this diligent cop that smelled decomposing bodies were over at his house because Gacy invited them over for a fish fry.
Yep.
Not that he was just going in there and looking around at a warrant.
Oh, I know. It was, I mean, at the beginning of the surveillance was a joke.
Yeah, but that's what I found so interesting was a bunch of these documentaries presented this as them doing diligent police work. And I don't want to downplay the fact that they were doing police work, but they were having to remind themselves to be professional police officers around this man.
Right. That's how I heard it too, that at the beginning of the surveillance, they were going to fish fries and having drinks with him and chatting him up. But I did hear that once they got the search warrant to search the crawl space of his house, that is when he really kind of started to fall apart.
Once they had that fish fry,
Yep.
and the cop smelled decomposing bodies,
and he made the comment about the clown.
Yeah, that's when they were like, okay,
maybe there's actually something to this.
They pushed for a second search warrant, and Gacy essentially knows that his time is limited.
Oh, yeah.
He is, at this point, falling apart. So he calls his attorney and says that he wants to come and talk to him, and he ends up spending the night where he does a 13-hour confession. Yeah. He said he calls his attorney and he's like, I have been the judge, jury, and executioner for a lot of people, and I want to be that for myself. He didn't want anybody else to be telling his story. He wanted to control the narrative. Mm-hmm. And even when he went to go tell his confession to his attorneys, he told the attorney, don't talk. I just want to tell it.
Yep. It was December 22nd of 1978 when he confessed that he had committed over 20 murders.
An interesting thing that they did when they were holding Gacy was one of the excuses that he said, I would get blackout drunk and I couldn't remember doing those things and it would bring something out of me. The defense attorneys had ordered a EEG alcohol test administered by Dr. Canova, a forensic psychiatrist. They wanted to observe Gacy's brain waves while he drank. Gacy claimed to be blackout drunk when drinking and not remembering his actions during those times. The defense set out to see if alcohol turned him into like this raging monster.
Right.
Gacy, who had not had a drink in 6 months, was given 6 shots of J&B Scotch for over an hour and 15 minutes apart each shot. The psychiatrist took a look to see if there was any physiological change in the function of the brain that would incur some, like, impaired behavior.
Right.
And in Gacy's case, there was, like, no change.
So he's a blackout drunk, and that's why he's doing this. that doesn't work. So then motherfucker says, well, I have split personality disorder, or I have multiple personality disorder. And the psychologists are like, no, you don't. No. Gacy showed absolutely no fractioning of his personality. And it's important to note that people who do have multiple personality disorders, their personalities might as well be another person. Like, they do not remember things they did under other personalities. So it's literally they're fractioned off, as in like to different people. Gacy didn't have that. He premeditated most of the murders that he committed. He was fully lucid, and the only disassociation he might have had is when he was dressed as Pogo the Clown for some of the murders. In 1980, this is when he tried to convince psychologists that he suffered from multiple personality disorder, which we know is not true. And his lawyers tried to plead guilty to reason of insanity, but this didn't work out for him. He was, studied by other psychologists, was deemed to be sane and competent, and that he was fully aware of his actions. The jury found Gacy guilty.
For his defense, he did have 4 psychiatrists that testified that Gacy was, in fact, mentally ill. Helen Morrison was one of his psychiatrists, and she first met Gacy before his trial in 1980 and spent over 50 hours with him in his room at Sir Mark Hospital at the Cooke County Jail before testifying in his defense that he was, in her opinion, legally insane. But what happened here is there is this big disagreement about the precise nature of his illness. And that's why we keep saying that it's so hard to unpack, because even the professionals who were on his side didn't know what the fuck to do with him.
He was officially diagnosed with antisocial personality disorder, which, as we know, is the common term for sociopaths or psychopaths.
Yeah.
But that doesn't really fit either.
So in Morrison's point of view, Gacy was unable to separate from his mother psychologically and never developed a separate identity. So during the murder, she said he believed that he was killing all the parts of himself that he didn't like. But the issue was whether or not he was legally insane when he committed the murders. So at the time, there was 2 key tests: whether he was able to understand that the criminality of his behavior and whether he was able to stop himself. And so she, I think, was more progressive in her thinking, but
also still not there. But as we've said, Gacy is like a whole other beast. Like, he was diagnosed with antisocial personality disorder, which a lot of serial killers are. And just to touch on antisocial personality disorder, that is marked with symptoms of lack of empathy, lack of caring for others, limited self-control.
Long-term pattern of disregard for or violation of the rights of others, a low moral sense or consciousness.
So, and it should also be noted that usually people who are diagnosed with APD are repeat criminals. Often drug addicts. They kind of stand out from society. They aren't social. That's the whole point of antisocial personality disorder. That's why...
I actually sent a text message to Chelsea late at night because, your brain thinks about things. And what I had known about APD was that I had always perceived it as like, ooh, that's an extreme diagnosis. That's a big deal.
And it is a big deal, but like every other mental disorder, mental disorders are on a spectrum. There are concrete diagnosis requirements for mental disorders, but like everything else in life, different people deal with things differently. So depression doesn't hit everybody the same. Anxiety doesn't hit everybody in the same way. Some people are more adept at coping with mental disorders than others. But this one's hard for me because there are others who are diagnosed with APD. Ted Bundy is one of them. Charles Manson is another. And Ted Bundy was very charismatic and very outgoing and really kind of charmed people. But he had a really hard time forming meaningful relationships with people in his life. He didn't really care about anybody. Whereas Gacy did.
The only relationship that he was unsuccessfully navigating was the one with his father.
Yeah.
All the other ones he navigated very well.
For me, like, APD is probably the one that fits the best.
But it still doesn't fit.
But it's still not right. And I don't know. This is my problem with the death penalty. Because I want to know more. I want more interviews with Gacy. I want more up-to-date psychological testing done on him.
Yeah, so I think he's a gigantic flaming piece of shit.
Oh, 100%.
Nobody is going to dispute that. And I fully support the death penalty. However, in cases like this, where they can contribute back to society to helping us identify why the brain is doing what it's doing. There is a greater contribution to science for the advancement of mankind that if we only were allowed to do this is dangerous territory, living experiments on psychopaths, that we would understand so much more and could progress as an entire
I will say, though, Gacy did contribute big time to Robert Ressler's FBI profiling. He interviewed Gacy at length, and Gacy really did contribute a lot of really good information to the behavioral psychology FBI unit, which if you've seen the Netflix show Mindhunters, that show is based off of that FBI behavioral science unit who was headed up by Robert Ressler.
He's basically the godfather of criminal psychology.
He really is. I mean, that's kind of where it all started. Serial killers weren't a thing.
He created the token term
of serial killer. And the show is absolutely fascinating, and you should definitely check it out if you haven't seen it yet.
He may still contribute to society in some weird way. After we don't know if he was cremated or buried. No. But after he was put to death, his body was taken to the local hospital for an autopsy to be performed. And during the autopsy, his family and John actually signed away the rights to his brain to one of his psychiatrists, Helen Morrison. And Helen took the brain, drove away with this bitch drove away with John's brain in her car. And
I mean, as a fellow psychology lover, I'm not a psychologist, so I can't call myself that. Mm-hmm. But I am proud of that bitch for having the forethought to think.
She was very progressive.
She really was, to think, okay, I can't really do anything with this right now, but one day, maybe.
She was hoping that. So she takes this brain, and she actually still has it. She keeps it in her basement, supposedly, but she still 100% still does have it.
Yes.
So she performed physical examinations of the brain and then sent it off to other professionals who want to remain anonymous. And no abnormalities were found, because sometimes if you have a traumatic brain injury, a TBI, or like cancerous tumors,
anything like that.
Anything that is pressing on the frontal lobe.
Anything that is really pressing on any part of your brain can impact behavior. Yes. But especially the frontal lobe deals a lot with memory and personality and things like that.
It actually, believe it or not, a brain injury can turn a good person into a monster. It can. It really can. And then there is actually a professional psychiatrist who his nephew had a traumatic brain injury, and he went from being this sweet, amazing child into this
horrible, violent individual.
All of the boxes that check a serial killer, he had the makings of. And so he funded with his very own money to have
brain scans
done of his nephew, and found that he had these brain traumas, and there was actually pressure building on his brain. So he was able to go in, pay for his nephew to have this operation done that alleviated that pressure and the abnormalities that he had.
And it turned his personality around.
But there's not enough science done like that. There's not enough information to the general public about those procedures. And so Chelsea's not going to talk about it, but I'm going to talk about the fact that Chelsea has almost a master's degree in psychology. It baffles me, and it baffles her, that if she was to be a practicing psychologist, it's one of the only medical practices where you don't get to physically examine the body, the part of the body that you're supposed to be working on and diagnosing.
Right. And I mean, if you think about it, neurology and psychology are completely separate fields, when really they should kind of be meshed, because neurology definitely affects psychology and vice versa. So when you're a psychiatrist or a psychologist, almost never do you get to look at brain scans. And there is one neuroscientist. I don't want to call him a psychiatrist because I don't think he's a...
No, he's a neuroscientist.
He's a neuroscientist. I don't think he's a psychiatrist. But Dr. James Fallon is diagnosed with APD. He is a psychopath, and he knows he is, but he is a neuroscientist who helps others. And he has actually come up with tests, and I'll have to, if we ever get to the Happy Face Killer, we definitely need to talk about him more because he was deeply involved in that case.
Yeah, absolutely.
But he actually does tests where he'll put you in an MRI machine and light your brain all up and ask you questions and put you in situations, and he can test your brain to see what areas are lighting up and what areas aren't, to tell if you have APD.
The amount of amazing information we could have if John Wayne Gacy was not put to death and he was subjected to those kinds of research. I mean,
the things we could know, it could be amazing.
To be frank, it could be insurmountable.
Oh, yeah.
Because there's not many people like John Wayne. You have to understand that he is so unique in terms of serial killers.
He really is, because he doesn't fit into those boxes. He was a family man. He was a community man. He was very involved and well-loved in his community, but he was this monster behind closed doors, and nobody knew about it. The jury did find Gacy guilty and sentenced him to death on 12 counts of murder. And he had 33 victims, and 8 of those victims still have yet to be identified.
So Rob Piest is what brought the downfall of John Wayne Gacy. And they were hoping at the time that they were still going to be able to find Rob alive. Because it had only been a couple of days at this point.
But they didn't.
And even when they were excavating, the forensic anthropologists were excavating the home, they didn't find him. The fucked up thing that happened here was that whenever they got that warrant and wanted to speak to John, the police contacted him and they were like, we want you to come down. We want to talk to you. How soon can you be here? And John was like, 30 minutes. So they're like, okay, we'll see you in 30. John runs back home to where Rob's body is and dumps him in the river, and then goes to the police.
Lord have mercy.
Lord have mercy.
So to wrap up our little story on Gacy's timeline here.
He spends 13 years in prison.
Yep, on death row.
He becomes an artist while he's in prison.
Did you see that he sold some of his paintings for $25,000?
Yes, there's a whole subculture of people who are really into serial killer paintings. I'll have to look up and see what they're called, and I'll add it in later. But yeah, he sold one of his paintings for $20,000.
It's just like, I hope he didn't get that money. Yeah, he died on May 9th, 1994 through lethal injection, and his last words to the general public were, "Kiss my ass." Yeah. So sweet.
In October 12th, 2011, the Cooke County Sheriff's Department announces that they're undertaking a new effort to try and identify the remaining 8 Gacy victims whose names were never known.
Yeah, they're hoping that the new forensic methods will be able to shed some light on who they may be.
A month later, they were able to identify one of the victims as William George Bundy, a 19-year-old construction worker from Chicago. And then in 2017, the Cooke County identifies 16-year-old James Hackison as one of Gacy's victims. The teenager had left his St. Paul home in 1976 and was never heard from again. He was one of 8 of Gacy's victims that was buried without being identified. Yeah. What they're kind of hoping now is in the past 2 years, we have made leaps and bounds of progress with DNA testing thanks to things like 23andMe. There's this thing called genetic genealogy, which things like 23andMe and Ancestry.com that do these DNA testing, they're actually able to link 4th, 5th, 6th cousins together. Right. And because these DNA things are being entered into a forum, forensic genetic genealogists are able to piece together identities of John and Jane Does. Mm-hmm. And so they're hoping that the more people who contribute their DNA to these forums are going to help them solve a lot of these unsolved crimes.
Right.
So that we might see in the next couple of years some more John Wayne Gacy people come forward.
Yeah, we might find out more of who his victims were.
But yeah, so that's pretty much everything.
Yeah, that was a lot.
Let's do our palate cleanser.
Okay.
Palate cleanser, this is the palate cleanser. I have a theme song now. Oh my God. I hope you're super excited. Theme song.
Him, what's your body count? Me, for what? Him, people you've slept with. Oh, I thought you saw the basement. John Wayne Gacy, the original Juggalo. Can we touch base on how short Charles Manson was?
Wait, Charles Manson was short?
Oh my God! Okay,
really?
Okay.
You know, it would be a fun drinking game? Drinking every time that we say fuck or god damn it.
No, that person would die of alcohol poisoning.
He would die of alcohol poisoning. All right, the Dahmer scale. This one's hard.
This one is really hard.
I said it first last time. You said it first this time.
So, I'm going to give him 8 out of 10 Dahmers.
Yeah. He's 8 out of 10 Jeffries is...
Yeah, I think a solid 8 out of 10. Because, I mean, let's be honest, there's more fucked up things.
Mm-hmm. What sets him apart from other serial killers is, like, they speculated there was 30 victims. Mm-hmm. They speculated there was 60 victims.
We know how many victims he had.
Bare minimum.
33.
Bare minimum.
I think that's all we have for Mr. John Wayne Gacy.
Yeah, that's all, folks. Happy Halloween.
Happy Halloween.
This is the Halloween episode.
Happy Halloween.
This is Halloween. This is Halloween. Halloween.
Next week on The Killer Tea,
we're going to have a very special guest.
A very special guest.
She hasn't given us permission to use her name yet, so we're going to call her Nighthawk.
So next week, join us to discuss The Vampire of Sacramento, Richard Trenton Chase.
Hi guys, welcome to episode 2 of what the fuck's our podcast called?
Christina and Chelsea being fatties.
Yes, that one. This is gonna be ASMR of me eating a pizza. It's delicious.
of that bread.
This is what you meant when you said working on the intro, right?
On the phone, we have TT. So, TT, you were in what grade when John Wayne Gacy was caught?
About 6th or 7th grade.
And what do you remember from that time?
I remember we moved from a small town in Nebraska to Illinois, and we were shocked by what was happening around us in our new town.
So did you understand the magnitude of what was happening, or
It was just very scary.
do you remember watching it on TV?
Yes, saw it on TV quite a bit, and of course jokes were starting to be heard and spread around about.
Can you share some of those jokes with us?
Yes, I'm very interested.
I can do that. What is the temperature in John Wayne Gacy's house?
What?
27 below. I've got one more. Why couldn't John Wayne Gacy go to the prom?
Why?
Because he couldn't dig up a date.
Oh, so bad.